The next presentation will come in remotely, and that's Dr. James Lavery, University of Toronto, on community engagement. Sorry. Dr. Lavery, are you there?
Hi there, I am.
Excellent.
Can you see me? Do a quick sound and video check.
You sound well. We can all hear you.
Good.
So it's all yours. The floor is yours, and we have your first slide up.
Okay, and I think, Angela, probably the most straightforward way is if I could just ask you to advance the slide, unless I'll have an option here on my screen to do that. I'm not sure. Okay, so I'm just going to ask Angela or whoever's there to advance the slides. So for me. So
Angela, she just sent you a request to give you presenter rights.
Oh, so it says share content. Okay, now I don't have the content on my iPad here. So will I be able to get access through to
Okay, we'll move the slides for you.
We'll do
Okay.
it from this end then, Jim.
You'll do it there. Okay, that's great. And you can still see me okay?
We're working on bringing up the first slide to the full screen. Give us 1 second.
Sure. Well, I'll just start with my, first of all, thank you very much to the committee for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about community engagement in this space today. And thanks also to the other presenters for some really excellent presentations. And hopefully my comments will build on some of the ideas that you've heard already. And so the next slide then after the title slide, if we're at that stage.
Yes, we are.
A quick overview. I want to just give a very high-level kind of background and context for community engagement, talk a bit about what community engagement is, a bit about the purpose and aims of community engagement, a bit about what failure looks like, a bit about what success might look like, some unresolved questions, and some take-home points, and then the list of suggested resources. So next slide, please. So my points of departure are actually also my take-home points. I thought rather than burying them.
Sorry, just to say, I can't see the slides anymore.
Can't see them.
No, we can't on the phone.
Oh, okay.
It's disappeared from the split screen view, so we could see the room and we could also see the slides, but we can't see the slides now.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, so I'm not sure what to do. I just have a share content button on my screen, and I don't have the slides up. I think Angela's taking back over the slides.
Give us just a minute. We're going to get them up again.
Sure.
Perfect. We can see them now. Thanks.
Great. So I'm on the points of departure, which I think is the third slide.
All right. This one? Science snipes at Oxitec, or letting the bugs out of the bag?
No, the slide number 3. We're way before that.
Okay. Just a second, we're going backwards.
Yeah. Getting there, getting closer. Oh, there's the big reveal. Sorry, Tony.
Now we're on your first slide.
So
Points of departure
so,
slide, okay.
So let me start that part again. So the points of departure are also going to be my take-home points. And the first point is that, and this may be a slightly pointed statement, but I think it's not wildly inaccurate, that community engagement is at odds in many ways with the current climate and culture of global health science and product development. People think it takes too much time, too much money, and it involves role expansion, asking people to do things that they don't normally do or that they're not necessarily trained for. The second kind of point of departure is that, and I'm just going to call it CE for efficiency, is that CE is seen primarily, I think, in the service of the research. So it's seen as a vehicle for communications, for approaches like social marketing, and all with the aim of endorsing the science. The third point is that there's a tendency, I think, to view the notion of community and the notion of stakeholders very narrowly. The third point is that there's still really limited agreement about the purpose of community engagement at all, what it is that we're trying to accomplish through these approaches. And similarly, there's very little agreement or guidance on community engagement as an ethical requirement in this type of research. And importantly, I think successes to date, and there have been some, and I'll talk briefly about some, but successes to date have relied very heavily on individual leadership, some of that from people who are on this call already today, including funders and investigators. And the final point of departure is that despite all of these kind of uncertain areas, it seems fairly clear that failure in communication can doom, community engagement rather, can doom projects or investments to failure. And successes in CE can facilitate research and foster public support. The next slide, please. And we can just flip through to the next slide for the content. So we got started in this area in 2005 with our Ethical, Social, and Cultural program in the Grand Challenges and Global Health Initiative. Next slide, please. And, you know, one of the very first people that we encountered is the dashingly handsome Tony James. And on literally the very first night of the Grand Challenges meeting in Seattle, Tony asked what I think was a very prophetic question. He asked, you know, what's the most effective way to engage communities in this type of research? And in Tony's case, it was preparing caged field trials for GM mosquitoes. So next slide, please. So over the course of the next few years, we worked with Tony, and this is his Mexican PI, Janine Ramsey, to try to help put some shape around this question. And after searching the literature and getting a sense about where thinking was, next slide, please, we came up with quite quickly, actually, came up with a set of points to consider around community engagement. That we thought was a reasonable estimate about what kind of rational, reasonable people might require if there were such a thing as requirements in this space, and there certainly hadn't been to that point. So next slide, please. And someone's already mentioned Oxitec, and around that same time that we were working with Tony and his team, Luke Alfie and the Oxitec people were also quite well underway with their trials in Cayman and preparing for Malaysia. And, you know, we saw a lot of coverage in the global media about this, and most of it was really focused on the same issue that was described for Florida, where people were frustrated with the way that these approaches have been introduced. Next slide, please. And fortunately for us, in a number of ways, but the lead editorial in Nature kind of picked up on the fact that we were trying to be explicit about some of the requirements that some of the underlying ethical goals in this Points to Consider document that we published, and they highlighted that this was probably a good thing for people to be doing. So we continued that work, and also the President's Commission on Bioethics picked up on our framework as well. Next slide, please. And they commented on community engagement broadly. They said, you know, community engagement really has emerged as a response to the practical challenges of conducting research in a wide range of social, political, and economic circumstances around the world. And of course, that's they were really referring, I think, to the globalization of research. The next slide, please. So, you know, an important placeholder for a lot of this conversation, I think, is the way we normally think about biomedical research. And to me, this is the kind of paradigm image of biomedical research. It's an individual in a tertiary care northern hospital who is undergoing some study of usually a drug or a device. But it's purely individually focused, and all of the ethical apparatus that we've developed around it and the regulatory apparatus is exclusively focused on the interests of the individual. Next slide, please. And, you know, in a very interesting maneuver, Bill Gates, a number of years ago in a TED Talk, did something very interesting. He took a jar of mosquitoes You just opened them up in the auditorium, and the mosquitoes started to fly around. And the camera was panning out to the audience occasionally as well, and it was just really quite fascinating to watch what happened. And people were fairly sure that the mosquitoes weren't carrying malaria parasites, but you could just see the disruption. You could see people sort of becoming uneasy. I hope it bites my neighbor and not me. And so for me, it was a really interesting image about how this type of activity goes beyond an effect on any targeted individual and has an impact more broadly at a community level. So next slide, please. So, of course, if you look at the similarities between what Bill Gates did on that stage, and this is a release of GM mosquitoes in the Moscomed in Juazeiro in northern Brazil, it's the same thing, but rather than in an auditorium, they're being released out into communities where people may or may not have a decent sense of what that's about or what the implications might be for them. So that's a little bit of a background. Next slide, please, and context for this. So the first question really is, what is this community engagement stuff that we're all talking about? And one of the first things that we did in our program was just to kind of look through the literature and get a sense about what was being said. Next slide, please. And what we found was that there are lots of definitions of community engagement. And next slide, please. And that's fine, but they're all very different in many ways. And over the course of the years, we've really settled on a much more straightforward, kind of simple account of what we think community engagement is. And this is our definition. It's not by any means the standard or received version. But we think of community engagement as a set of strategies that help researchers establish relationships with stakeholders who may be affected by their research. Next slide, please. And then right on to the next one. So, trying to figure out what the purpose or the aims of community engagement are about. And next slide, please. And there was a piece in the New York Times in 2013 talking about the, I have one of these automatic light things in my office where it shuts off if I'm not moving. The point, this is about the Oxitec trials, and it says, communities aren't monolithic. Deciding who has the authority to give the go-ahead to scientists who want to release genetically altered pests isn't easy. And the take-home from this for me is that a lot of what we're trying to get at in these community engagements has something to do with the way these trials are appropriately authorized. So next slide, please. And the purposes and aims, they're really practical, or what I think of as instrumental aims of community engagement. And they're also ethical aims. And these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. But really, to date, the specific aims of community engagement have typically not been made explicit. And just a point, we had a great discussion about some of the concepts and ideas out there in the ethics space. And Steven Pinker, in his new book, talks about terms like community engagement as meta concepts. He says they actually don't really mean anything. They're concepts about other concepts, and they don't really mean much until we specify and stipulate meanings for any given setting. So next slide, please. So some of the practical aims of community engagement are about identifying appropriate sites for the research, introducing a research plan, which usually has been finalized in advance and just delivered to the communities, determining the necessary processes and procedures for gaining access to the relevant communities, both in the terms of the geography, at a regulatory level and at the people level, gaining regulatory approval, and securing collaborations with local investigators and institutions that are necessary to achieve the research objectives. Next slide, please. So we've done a fair bit of work in the last little while about the ethics or ethical aims of community engagement, and the paper that this is from is referenced in the final list. But we think about the ethics in the following way. We say that we engage communities in research to learn about how research may affect their interests, so that we can take appropriate steps to acknowledge those interests, be responsive to them, and thereby protect them. Next slide, please. And so these processes of learning, acknowledging, responding, and protecting are central to what we think of as three key ethical goals of community engagement. And the first is to identify and help to manage non-obvious risks and benefits. A lot of what goes on at this level is not easy to see, easy to find. It's very subtle, very social. The second is this idea of trying to expand the notion of respect beyond the super fixation on the individual and informed consent as the sole means of authorization for these kind of community level activities. And then the third part is really to help build the legitimacy for the research program in a more political sense. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the identifying the non-obvious factors, this can help to sort of generate insights about what's at stake for people, what interests are in play. And the expanding respect is fundamentally about acknowledging and being responsive to persons and collectivities and the interests that they hold. And then on the legitimacy side, it's really about trying to put in place opportunities for dialogue and deliberation, to provide reasons and justifications for action, and to respond to concerns of interest. And these, of course, are kind of central notions in the deliberative democracy. Next slide, please. So we try to get our mind around what failure would look like. And here's a quote from the Cayman Island News, which I think really just nails it. And it says, the use of an overseas territory without public consultation for such an experiment was an act of colonialism. This is a very, very weighty term, colonialism, and it really captures this notion of these external forces appropriating many things and being presumptuous in many ways, and dealing extremely disrespectfully with people. And so, thanks. So next slide, please. And so certainly on the discussion about malaria, we know that we're talking a lot about Africa, and there's been some really terrific work done that just uncovers the anthropology and history of exploitation of African people, African countries in the service of scientific discovery and advancement. Next slide, please. And one of the ideas that seems central ethically in all of these stories is what we think of as the harm of disregard. And this is about failing to acknowledge stakeholders as people, failing to recognize and acknowledge that people have interests, assuming that certain people or certain interests are less worthy of acknowledgement and engagement than others, failing to engage with individuals or groups that have relevant interests, and imposing risks on people with no process of acknowledgement or engagement. Next slide, please. So, and when this happens, again, it's from the same piece in the New York Times, what this does, though, in the public mind is it undermines people's belief in science. It creates skepticism. And I think this has been amply reflected in a lot of the media attention that's come up around certainly the Cayman trials in particular. So science must change the way it engages with the world as it both reduces and creates risk. Okay, what does success in community engagement look like? Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've been working on, next one again, please. One of the things that we've been working on for the last few years, we've published a lot of these, but there's still some waiting in the pipeline, and I apologize for the delay in getting the papers out, but they're all coming soon. But we looked at a number of contexts in global health and looked at community engagement activities, and we tried to distill out some good practices or observations that we thought were relevant to good practice. The two yellow ones are Tony's cage field trials in Mexico in the yellow, and we have a successful PhD thesis on that's been defended, and I'll put that on the list. It's not there now, but it is accessible, and we're trying to get some of those papers out from that, and Tony, apologies again for how long that's taken. And more recently, we published a paper on the other yellow one, which is Scott O'Neill's Wolbachia trials in Northern Australia. Even though they're not gene-drive mechanisms, I think they're kind of instructive. So next slide, please. So this was a case study then looking at the community engagement activities in this Eliminate Dengue program in Queensland and Northern Australia. And really what we found was that there were there are two sort of main areas that we think contributed to the success, to the community support, the widespread community support that was seen. The first is what we call kind of foundations or founding conditions. And the first is these enabling conditions, really intensive support and understanding by funders in particular. And the second is internal leadership, very strong internal leadership, driving the importance of community engagement and these values into the team. Think about them as ethics drive systems, if you like. Then notions of articulating and being responsive within your team to core commitments and guiding values, and then conducting formative research, not just about whether people are going to like your technology, but about how they want to be engaged and what the meaning and implications of that engagement would be for them. And the second dimension where we saw some what we think are signs of success are in the operations. One is about how the community engagement team itself was built, very systematic, very mindful. The second point is about the integration of the insights coming from the community engagement team into the internal program management of the overall program. The second is an intensive amount of energy and time devoted to discerning the community of stakeholders, which was viewed very broadly. The next, then, establishing and maintaining an actual presence, a human presence in the host communities, not just signs and advertisements, but people out in the community. And through this, socializing the technology and the research process. The next slide, please. So, and this is really my last slide because the next one is a repeat. But here are what I see as some unresolved questions that the committee may want to turn some additional attention to. The first is that we still don't really know how community engagement works. Part of the case study I just described and the other work we've done is to try to get some sense about how this stuff actually works. And so I think we need more development of a theory of change or theories of change around community engagement. The second part is, how do you assess the value of these things? Value is determined by multiple perspectives. There are multiple interests at play here. And so there's no simple linear way to assess the value. Another question that we have is that, it's not always clear under what circumstances community engagement is really required. Or subsequently, if we think it is required, what the appropriate design or scope of community engagement is for any given trial or project. It may be, for example, that the success that Tony or Scott have had could be a reflection of overinvestment in community engagement. We still don't have a good sense about how that works. The next thing is examples of community engagement. What we don't know yet these kinds of approaches when we're dealing with large populations, say for broad field releases. We don't yet know how to cost community engagement out or how to budget it. It's so rare that there are explicit budgets for these things other than a few areas like HIV prevention trials. And so we still don't have a good handle on how much this would cost and what the relationship is with accounts of value. And for IRBs that are going to have to review these trials, we don't have good guidance. So we don't know how IRBs what they should be looking at, what's appropriate, what's good practice, what's ethical practice. And then finally, I think more broadly, we don't have a good sense about how to cultivate a deeper appreciation of the ethical and practical significance of community engagement amongst scientists, funders, and implementing partners. Slide, please, which is, again, also the last. So this is the same take-home points that I started, and these, I think, may be of some use for further consideration. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks. Thanks very much for that really interesting presentation.
Can we ask all the people joining us remotely, please mute your phones? We are getting a lot of background noise in the room, except for Jim Lavery.